Benjamin Franklin once said, quote, democracy is two wolves and a lamb voting on what they are going to have for lunch. Stop quote. That tells you, from a lamb's point of view, that democracy is not enough. The wolves are going to vote to eat the lamb. Democracy by itself is meaningless unless you have a set of rules to protect every individual. The rules have to state that the wolves may not eat the lamb, no matter how lofty their stated purpose may be. In modern times, we call these rules a constitution. The constitution is a book of rules that protects the rights of lambs by limiting the behavior of wolves. That's right, a constitution should ideally limit what a state can do to its citizens. But this raises a difficult question. What if a popular leader says that, hey, listen, I have the people of this nation with me, therefore I am legitimate. This constitution is only legitimate as long as I say so. If I don't agree with some part of it, I will change it. What happens to the lamb then? Is this attitude something we should be worried about in India? Well, 70 years ago, this was the exact position taken by Jawaharlal Nehru.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. You know, we live in times when everyone looks at the world through binaries. If you're not with us, you're against us. If you're not the purest of white, you're the blackest of black. This has especially happened since 2014 when Narendra Modi won elections. For members of the tribe of Modi, history ended in 2014. Nothing after that can be discussed and everything is Nehru's fault. For people in the anti-Modi tribe, history began in 2014. We can only talk about the wrong that has happened since then. Before that, India was a golden age and our leaders were saints. Now, this is obviously a ridiculous binary and it affects how we look at history. Consider Nehru, for example, who for one side is a saint and for the other side, a demon. Nehru was a complex man. He was a great leader during the freedom struggle, and when he became Prime Minister of India, he got some things right and he got some things wrong. You can ascribe some of his mistakes to the temper of the times, and you can ascribe some of them to his own temperament. Nehru contained multitudes. Similarly, our constitution contains multitudes. You know, people often speak of the constitution as if it is some sort of holy book. But the truth is, it's not a book at all. It was a book for just over a year between 1950 and 1951, after which, as one famous cartoon says, it ceased to be a book and became a periodical. Starting with Nehru, it became common that whenever a court called an action by a prime minister unconstitutional, the prime minister just went and changed the constitution. The first amendment came in 1951, and in that, as well as through subsequent amendments like the 3rd, the 4th, the 7th, the 17th, our rights were diluted as the constitution became less and less liberal. No less than the father of the constitution, B.R. Ambedkar, said in 1954, at the time of the 4th Amendment, that the constitution had been so degraded that he wanted to burn it. Ambedkar, of course, was in the government at the time of the First Amendment, which is such a fascinating period in India's history. The government in power at the time, led by Nehru, realized that the constitution came in the way of much of what they wanted to accomplish, so they set about to amend it. My guest today is the scholar Tripurdaman Singh, who has written an excellent book called 16 Stormy Days. 16 Stormy Days lays out the details of the complex political landscape of those times, showing how so many of the leaders involved, including Nehru, were creatures of circumstance. You could even say they were responding to incentives. I wish every Indian, especially every Indian on Twitter, would read this book because it would give so much nuance to their understanding of Indian politics. One of my big learnings from the book was about our free speech laws. I'm a free speech absolutist and I've always railed in column after column after column against Section 124A of the Indian Penal Code, which is a sedition law, as well as 153A and 295A. These are all colonial era laws. They should not exist today, right? Well, as Tripurdaman points out, these laws were deemed to be unconstitutional in 1950. But the caveats to free speech added in the First Amendment made them constitutional again. Just some of the TIL moments in this superb book and in this episode. Before we get to our conversation though, let's take a quick commercial break. If you enjoy listening to The Seen and the Unseen, you can play a part in keeping the show alive. The Seen and the Unseen has been a labor of love for me. I've enjoyed putting together many stimulating conversations, expanding my brain and my universe, and hopefully yours as well. But while the work has been its own reward, I don't actually make much money off the show. Although The Seen and the Unseen has great numbers, advertisers haven't really woken up to the insane engagement level of podcasts, and I do many hours of deep research for each episode, besides all the logistics of producing the show myself. Scheduling guests, booking studios, paying technicians, the travel and so on. So I'm trying a new way of keeping this thing going, and that involves you. My proposition for you is this. For every episode of The Seen and the Unseen that you enjoy, buy me a cup of coffee, or even a lavish lunch, whatever you feel it's worth. You can do this by heading over to seenunseen.in/support and contributing an amount of your choice. This is not a subscription. The Seen and the Unseen will continue to be free on all podcast apps and at seenunseen.in. This is just a gesture of appreciation. Help keep this thing going. seenunseen.in/support. Tripurdaman, welcome to The Seen and the Unseen.
Thank you so much for having me, Amit. It's an absolute pleasure.
Tripurdaman, before we get started at talking about your fascinating book, which I enjoyed so much and I wish many more people read and internalized, I'd love to know about your personal background. Like, how did you become a historian? What were your sort of intellectual influences, the historians that you looked up to? What drew you to history as a discipline?
So I actually have always had a kind of fascination for history and for politics. And when I was going to university, I kind of really thought hard about, which line to take. And I ended up going with politics. But I found that while I did really enjoy the kind of, I studied politics and international relations for my undergraduate degree, and I really enjoyed it. But I always felt that there was... history kind of always had a lot more fascination. I mean, it kind of interested me in a way that sort of political theory and international relations theory didn't. So then I ended up doing a master's in South Asian studies at Cambridge, where I was taken on as a student by Christopher Bailey. And that was that was my first real introduction to historical research. And it was kind of eye-opening in many ways. It really kind of forced me to broaden the way I think, the way I kind of work. And I think Bailey exercised quite a great influence on me. And so that's how I ended up. And then because I did quite well, he was like, well, you should think about a PhD. And I, really liked him. I really liked what I did. And that was kind of how I went into it. And progressively, the more I read and the more I came across, the more I wanted to read, and the more I wanted to get into the thick of the sort of archival action and research. And I think one thing really led to another, and in the end, that I've kind of ended up doing this as an academic. So far so good, I'd say.
And, while you got down to it and you've written one book before this and, as you kind of approached that project, were you sort of just going with the flow and just picking up what interested you at the time? Or were there sort of themes that had always fascinated you, which you sort of took the opportunity to explore?
So I actually started out with working on 18th and 19th century India, because that's what I had, 10 years ago, that's what I thought was one of the most fascinating periods of Indian history. It still is, but it was a kind of period of real flux, and it's the kind of period, say, someone like William Dalrymple writes about. And some of the things that were kind of happening were just mind-boggling. You had, adventurers from Luxembourg setting up, little kingdoms. You had the kind of titular Mughal empire still kind of soldiering on. There was so much going on, and making sense of how things happened was constantly a sort of challenge, because I had never, when I did start with history, I'd never studied history academically before, not for my undergraduate, not even for my, final 2 years of school. So I found the whole process of doing research really fascinating. And I think the 19th century was kind of a very, very interesting period to start with, because it was one I was working with, possibly one of the greatest, historians of his generation. And secondly, it was a kind of project which really needed you to, dig into, quite old archival material. It would take, you would sit through 200-year-old documents. And I found the whole process really fascinating. And that period, because it's even now such a contested sort of time in Indian history, it's very politically charged to talk about, as you can see now, to talk about, for example, the period which was the end of the Mughal Empire and the kind of rise of the British. And so I found, when I started out, I think I had didn't have a very precise idea of where the project would go. But as things developed, there were kind of certain themes which have really kind of stuck with me since. And those include things like the idea of the law, the concept of sovereignty, how these sort of kind of small adventurers or small like kingdoms set up political entities within the sort of framework of the empire, really. And so I think those themes have kind of stuck with me, and some of them are kind of even reflected in this work on the Constitution, because the idea of law and ideology is kind of laced through this work as well.
So, sort of a couple of questions. One question is that, most of us non-historians, when we think of the telling of history, we think of it as, okay, you research a lot of facts and you build a story around it and you tell a story. But obviously, for a historian, you are sort of doing many different things. What is the process of doing history per se as a historian really like? Do you have to sort of set aside preconceptions and that you might have, or that existing narratives about it, and of course a hindsight bias where we already know what happened, but in the moment it's never apparent what's going to happen? What are the sort of adjustments you have to make when you actually sit down to the practice of studying and writing history, especially, as you say, since you took it up while in your post-graduation and you hadn't really studied the formal art of doing history before that?
I think it's quite hard to start from a kind of blank canvas. We all have certain biases, certain, I wouldn't say preconceptions, but certain ideas about the world, about the past. And I don't think you can start from a blank canvas, but you have to be willing to let your own ideas be challenged and be willing to kind of take them apart and put them back together again. So I think that's something that is really important, and that's something that I've really learned through the last several years. And I think one of the problems that I first had when I started my I'd say my work as a historian was my unfamiliarity with kind of the historiographical and methodological tools that we use, because we do more than just tell a story. And facts are always, facts are never really facts in the way that people often understand them. They have to be contextualized. You have to interrogate your sources, because just because someone's saying something 200 years ago doesn't, their word doesn't necessarily make it true. So you have to be able to read them against the grain, and you have to also think of how the world was at the period that you were writing about. And that's where a lot of the kind of theory that we forced to really, well, not necessarily forced to, but you have to come to terms with it, is sort of different ways of conceptualizing the past. And you have to be willing to, and I feel that's where like most of the grunt work really lies. It's the sort of collection of facts and retelling of facts, or is the easy part. Contextualizing it and interpreting it in the light of the broader framework that you're using to assess it, or other ideas about the period that you're talking about. That's where the real work lies, because you have to also take on board ideas that other people have, which may be diametrically opposite to yours, and we can't simply ignore them and say, well, I'm going to say this. Which I guess you can in, if you're writing as an amateur, or if you're, but for something to stand the kind of stand the scrutiny of your peers. It has to be willing to take on board a lot of ideas that you don't necessarily agree with. And I think that's one of the major differences between having a kind of not necessarily academic, but I'd say a professional historian versus a kind of raconteur of stories.
And you mentioned that you spoke about the framework through which you approach history and you look at history. And obviously, as you said, none of us are blank slates going into looking at whatever we're looking at. So how much of this sort of framework was influenced by your studies of political science? For example, you mentioned about how, in your earlier book, you were interested in ideas of sovereignty and law and so on and so forth. And, even in this book, there's a very, a crisp, cogent, very lucid understanding of constitutionalism and liberalism and sort of the central fault lines of that period, which is of course the political imperatives of the Congress Party and Nehru versus a constitutional project that they had embarked upon, which is a very clear line and yet a frame that I haven't seen many other people who write about that period use it all. So how important was all of that political science training in defining sort of the way you look at history? And do you think that that's something that all historians sort of carry with them, that the frame also matters? It's not just, how scrupulously you can, get all the facts and tell the story, but even the way you interpret it.
I mean, you're absolutely right. It does. The kind of the framework that you use and the kind of narrative that you build are hugely important parts of the story you tell. And like my last book, because I felt this was, I mean, it's both it's the kind of story that deserves to be really widely read. It's something that people are very unfamiliar with and something that affects everybody's life quite intimately in ways that, we don't often acknowledge. And for that reason, I tried to keep things as lucid, as crisp, as sort of easy to access as I could. And that's because I was writing for an audience that may not necessarily be invested in history in the same way as I would have written it if I was writing, for Oxford University Press. And I think that kind of makes a huge difference. As far as my sort of background in politics goes, I think it's given me a good kind of basic idea of the kind of ideological elements that come into being, as well as the, I'd say a sort of historical background of many of these, ideas such as liberalism or constitutionalism. And I think looking back, it's probably been quite helpful because I can perhaps talk about both sides of the story with what I hope is like relative clarity. And I hope that that's something that comes across in the book as well.
I was struck by the clarity of the writing and the fact that it's a book that can be read by the lay reader and not someone who only reads history for that matter. So were there any models in terms of historical writing that you looked at for this kind of book?
There isn't really a specific model. I think it's just something that's come to me through reading a lot of historians. And there are some books which, really are very, very interesting, but then they're also written in a kind of way that makes them quite dull to read. And, I'd read them through, because of the level of interest that I have in it, but someone else might not. And I think my thought always was that anyone with a slight interest in history or politics should be able to pick this book up and be able to read it, no matter whether they're like 16 or whether they're 60, and be able to make sense of it, because it's not the easiest subject to talk about. But on the other hand, it's hugely important. And I think that's part and parcel of a historian's craft, is to, especially if you're writing about something that has such a huge bearing on the contemporary world, to make your material accessible to a wide audience. And I think one of the ideas, and this is like, well, I once watched, I watched the film a long time ago, but I once read a review of the old Hindi film Dhund, which is from the 1970s. And the the reviewer wrote one of the reasons that he really loved the film was that he was like, yeah, the action moves at the pace of a gunshot. And that's something that's always struck with me, is you shouldn't make things more complicated than they are. And you shouldn't unnecessarily pad out what you want to say. So if it can be said in a kind of way that keeps the narrative flowing quickly, and it can be said in a way that is, clear and accessible, then that's what you should go for.
The other thing that struck me was, like you said, it's a hugely important book, and we'll come to that when we discuss the book. But it also struck me that the writing of it at this time is also surely something that you must have thought twice about, because, doing history means you're embracing nuance, as you have done in this book. But modern politics, especially in the last few years, is really the stripping away of nuance. And history has almost been weaponized. And, we've created all these stark binaries through which we look at history, where for one side, Nehru is all black, and for the other side, Nehru is all white, and there's no other way of looking at it. And similarly, figures like Shama Prasad Mukherjee and all of those, there are many people today who purport on the one hand to support the Congress, but on the other hand, they treat the Constitution almost as a holy book. I mean, sometimes they will say in response to an argument, but that is unconstitutional, as if that is automatically the end of the argument and you don't need to say anything about it. While the reality, of course, is that, as that old cartoon goes, the Constitution is less of a book and more of a periodical. Nehru, in fact, was in the habit of every time something he did was deemed unconstitutional, he simply amended the Constitution, not just in the First Amendment, as you write about, but the 4th, the 7th, the 17th, which went to Parliament just before he died. He sort of did this repeatedly. So, you would have known when you began this book that this was sort of, not fitting in these polarized times. It would just be, it would not be an easy project to do. What did you think about it in that sense? Like, did that increase the urgency of doing the book, that, something needs to counter the prevailing narratives, or is it something that made you think twice?
No, I think actually that's one of the reasons why I really wrote it, was that it sort of inverts so many of these binaries that we've come to accept as a given. And it's if somebody approaches it with an open mind, it kind of really scrambles the sort of easy, the kind of easy dichotomies that we draw. And it's a story that needs nuance, but equally it's something that really sort of has the potential to throw things a bit off kilter. And yes, I knew when I wrote it that when I was writing it, that it has the potential to be used as a kind of political tool in the current climate. But of course, I finished writing it before the kind of, the protests over the CAA, etc. happened, which really brought the Constitution suddenly back into public debate. So it wasn't expressly written with the intent of being a kind of intervention in the debates of today, but I was well aware that it is something that impinges quite heavily on today's world. And the thing is, nobody comes out of it looking like you would expect. So it has potential to be, I guess, used as a kind of intellectual weapon. But I think that potential is open-ended, so it can be used by either side to criticize the other. And I think that is something that I was aware of. And I think that's what makes it interesting.
It's a fascinating book, and also, for the human aspects of it. You've kind of made all of these people, Nehru, Patel, Mukherjee, and so on, so much more three-dimensional than we otherwise knew of them. And, just as you bring the lens of politics and political science, rather, in your telling of history, I kind of, invoke economics in my podcast a lot. So as I was reading this book, it kind of, confirmed my sense of how incentives shape actions and shape behavior. And I had a question for you on that, because one of the interesting things that you've pointed out, and it's like a strand through the book, and it's endlessly fascinating, is, and we'll discuss the book in detail, the context and everything that happened. But one of the strands that really struck me was that at the time of the First Amendment being carried out, Rajaji and Ambedkar were both part of the establishment.
Yeah.
And they played a part in actually getting many of these amendments through. Rajaji, the sort of the anti-free speech parts of it, and Ambedkar, all the rest of it, and they were in government and they were all for it. And yet, after they are in government, as you pointed out, Ambedkar actually represented the zamindars against the very act that he had helped bring about. And
Yeah.
similarly, Rajaji goes on to form the Swatantra Party and become a beacon of liberalism, while their acting while in government is contrary to that. And it sort of struck me about that old truism of Lord Acton that power corrupts. And it strikes me that their behavior is actually entirely natural if you consider the incentives, that if you're part of the executive, that arm of government, you will obviously be drawn to actions that strengthen the part of the government which you are part of. You might not think of it like that, but that's pretty much what you'll be drawn to. So to me, it's not so much of a contradiction that when they were part of the government, they behaved in a way that would strengthen their arm of government. And then once they're out of it, they can go back to talking about principles. And, similarly, Nehru, much earlier, before he became prime minister, warned of his own dictatorial tendencies. And yet when he became a prime minister, he ignored the warnings of his past self in a way. Now, you've obviously, studied that period and these people much more than me. So what is your sense of this, that to what extent can they be, and unconsciously, of course, not, justifying it in these terms, but to what extent are they actually responding to incentives and can be read as creatures of their circumstances?
No, they were definitely creatures of their circumstances. And that kind of comes through in the sort of reasons that they invoke. And I never quite point out, I never hint that they were, for example, somehow inherently evil or like somehow inherently, their moral compass was corrupted. They were obviously responding to the situation as they saw it. But the incentives part, how I'd put it is that they have, I think part of it is to do with the fact that they were quite, as Patel once, I pointed out at some point in the book where Patel tells Nehru, this is the result of idealistic exuberance. And I think the idealism had a major role to play somewhere, because they just passed the constitution. They had, all of these grand ambitions, and they either thought of themselves as kind of above these kind of despotic tendencies, or as people who would, wield them with the idea of utmost benevolence. And that is, I feel, one major aspect of why they did what they did. Secondly, there was, of course, the incentive, and the incentive was driven also by the fact that they were the only organized political force that there was. So there was no real incentive to take on board the views of the opposition or the warnings, issued by figures like Mukherjee or Kripalani or people like that, because there was the idea that they would somehow at some point have to face the same tools that they were crafting was just so far-fetched. And I think that probably made it easy enough to contemplate these measures that I think they probably would not have if there had been any real political organization with the standing to challenge the Congress. And I think that was one major incentive. I think the other, again, and this is I think quite common to most democracies, is that the incentive, if possible, to take shortcuts to gain political benefit is always there, and a lot of these people quite clearly succumb to it.
There's a fascinating passage from your book which I'll read out, which is, in fact, about the Congress, where you write, from its earliest days, the Congress party had claimed to speak for the entirety of the nation and to represent all Indians. The party was as committed to denying every other group or party a seat at the political high table as it was to gaining control of the levers of power. As the self-declared representative of the nation, the Congress laid claim to possession of the colonial state and all its territory. With the advent of democracy and the inauguration of the Constitution, this position, incompatible with any idea of constitutional democracy, was strained to breaking point, when his collectivist murings and his intolerance of opposing ideologies clashed with an expansively liberal constitution. The Congress party, instead of defending the normative foundations of democracy and the fundamental rights enshrined in the Constitution, instinctively turned on its own creation. Stop quote. So give me a sense of, in your book, what you've done an excellent job is of laying out the context of that immediate period between, 26 Jan 1950 when the Constitution comes into being, and then the First Amendment 14 months later. But give me a broader sense of the context of these times as we come into this, that what is a Congress's approach. And my sense in a way was that people like Nehru and Patel and whatever, when they spoke so highly of the fundamental rights and all of that earlier, were in a sense doing what we would today call virtue signaling. But when they realized that it would impact their ability to do all the things that they wanted to do, which the Congress was predicated upon, because the whole Congress's platform was social change and a certain kind of progressism, which then those fundamental rights got in the way of. So, how was all of that sort of playing out? Was this clash between fundamental rights and politics kind of inevitable in the way the last few years shaped up, or was it sort of contingent upon the circumstance of Nehru being the person who happened to be the prime minister? What is your sense of that?
A quick word about that quote, though. So that's a whole school of Indian history would kind of subscribe to that view, and I think I referenced that to Sunil Khilnani, but of course there are also others like Perry Anderson, etc. And so partition, for example, was something that was framed in Congress circles as a price that they had to pay to have a centralized state under their own control. And that kind of reflects, again, I think it kind of testifies to the idea that I think that the Congress was quite committed to a centralized state under its own control. And I mean, one of the sticking points throughout the 1930s and 1940s in Indian politics is the Congress demand to be taken for, the Congress demand for the British to consider it the sole representative of the nation. And ultimately, that's what becomes a stumbling block. It becomes a stumbling block in the 40s with the rise of the Muslim League, because it becomes a position that's completely untenable. Once the Muslim League wins the majority of Muslim seats, it becomes quite apparent that the Congress doesn't represent the entirety of the nation, because they lose quite badly in the Muslim seats. And that kind of idea but the idea doesn't really die, because the thing is, it's thought that that problem has been overcome, or at least sidelined with partition. And so once the exercise to write the Constitution, etc., begins, you have token representation of other groups. And I think it's done with the idea that you give the impression that it's a very representative assembly. But as people never tire of pointing out, even during the Constituent Assembly debates, it's essentially a one-party body in a one-party country. There is no other party. And party that dominates the Constituent Assembly also holds the levers of executive power. And once the Constitution comes into force, and everyone knows that an election is going to be held, it also creates a kind of incentive for people who are already, in the Constituent Assembly, and to kind of toe the orders that come from Nehru and Patel, because a lot of them want to be re-elected, and the only way that they will get their nominations is if they keep the party bosses content. And so that's, again, contemporary sort of articles in the press speak about this openly. So, and then, of course, you also have the kind of decline of Sardar Patel, because he's, by the mid-1950s, he's actually bedridden for most of the time. And he passes away in 1950. And by then, Nehru is already more or less ascendant. I talk about it at some point in the book with the Nasik Congress, where in Patel's absence, Nehru kind of has his own way. And eventually, after Patel's death, really, you have a system where Nehru is such a political colossus that there is no one really in the cabinet who can, stand up to him or put forward a strong alternative position. Nehru's biographer, Sarvapalli Gopal, who is actually very sympathetic to Nehru, calls it a sort of collection of moldering mediocrities. And so the context is that the political capital that Nehru brings to bear, much like today, ensures that he is capable of getting his own way. And I think I make a reasonably strong case in the book for arguing that much of it is driven by Nehru's own personal investment in these policies rather than any sort of great pressure from the states, because he resists the pressure when for things that he kind of feels very strongly about. And on the other side, equally, you have figures like S.P. Mukherjee or H.N. Kunzru or even Kripalani, who then resigns from the Congress. They're very articulate. They're very good at the sort of ins and outs of parliamentary debate. But unfortunately, no one has the kind of political organization or the public standing to mount a significant challenge. And I think that's a kind of interesting thing to note, because it has so many contemporary echoes, the way like we sort of conceptualize today.
Yeah, I mean, those contemporary echoes are, sort of echoed, as it were, throughout my reading of the book. Because in our modern times as well, we seem to have a single party which is utterly dominant, as it was then. We have a larger-than-life figure in charge of that party. You just repeated a quote about the quality of Nehru's cabinet, and a similar thing could possibly be said about this one, about how eminences like Arun Shuri, for example, were just sidelined in 2014, and you've got a much weaker cabinet than you could have. And equally, you have worries about the constitution, about how it's been degraded and sort of made meaningless, and how that particular arm of the state is being strengthened as compared to the others. Though those, one could argue today that, hey, the constitutions was already degraded. That you talk of the, I'm struck by something Kapil Komireddi said on Twitter, where somebody was complaining about the murder of democracy when these recent farm bills were passed the way they were, which was a murder of democracy. But as Kapil pointed out, it was not just murder, it was also mimicry, because it's all happened before. And your book is very instructive in that regard. And, I used to often joke about how, despite blaming Nehru for everything, Modi has actually, mimicked him in many ways. I mean, and what I mainly meant was the whole central planning, top-down approach of the economy. But even with the approach towards power, the approach to the constitution, it's extremely similar. So tell me a little bit about what Nehru's imperatives and his incentives at the time were, because he came in like 1950 is when the constitution is there. He is aware that he is part of a government which hasn't yet got a popular mandate. It's a transitionary government in that sense. He needs a popular mandate. Part of that mandate rests on fulfilling the promises he has made. Those promises include the zamindari reforms and, reservations and so on and so forth, the whole social progressive element of it. And suddenly he finds that this constitution is in the way. What the hell is going on? Tell me a little bit about what are his imperatives and how is he responding to them?
I think there are several, actually. So one, of course, is the fact that Nehru is, especially with zamindari abolition, that's a policy that Nehru is personally invested in and personally identified with. So the Congress Party runs a tremendous sort of public contact program, really, for zamindari abolition. I think in UP alone, there were like 35,000 public meetings. Probably Bihar had a similar number. And so there's a lot of political capital that's being invested in this. And, from the top to the bottom, from, small-time leaders like district presidents to more senior figures such as, Nehru himself, but also figures like Charan Singh and, C.B. Gupta, etc., who are very, very both vocal and kind of committed to a particular form of zamindari abolition and land reform. And, of course, the Congress, having acquired the levers of power, is also a bit, I think the easiest way to describe it would be suffering from a slight hangover of the Raj, because it's hard to convince the public that having gotten rid of one set of rulers, the other set of rulers do not have similar powers or are constrained by notions of constitutionalism or legality. So when the kind of first judgment, which is the staying of the Bihar Act, happens, it comes as a huge shock, not only because it kind of takes a sort of sledgehammer to their political capital because it shows everyone that their word is not infallible, but also because it's something that has been discussed over and over again within the Constituent Assembly. And it was something, the right to property is something that had been debated extensively in past as a form of compromise between those who were kind of votaries of a strong right to private property and those who felt that it would come in the way of zamindari and land reform. So this was something that had not been really considered possible. Zamindari abolition had been considered a done deal, and plenty of Congress figures are on record saying this is going to happen regardless of anything else. Quotes such as constitution or no constitution, this zamindari abolition will come into place. So once they realize that it can't, it kind of leads to a sort of real shockwave within the Congress party, and many suspect that with the money and the sort of local power that many of the zamindars have and can bring to bear, that there is the forthcoming election is something to be really thought about, because from the other side, and there are zamindari parties which are in the fray, and many of them are quite confident about being able to take on the Congress. So that's another thing that Nehru is acutely conscious of, that going back to the people without fulfilling what he has personally promised would amount to a kind of betrayal. And he says this in several letters to his chief ministers and to his colleagues, that it's something that he doesn't want to countenance. Equally, it's also something that state chief ministers do not want to countenance, and Bihar definitely doesn't want to countenance that. And they become like the first sort of people to demand a constitutional amendment to pass their law. There's, of course, a kind of longer story connected to that law, which is that Bihar law is the only one that is found to be unconstitutional, unlike similar laws in UP and later in Maharashtra. The Bihar law is basically held to be unconstitutional on a technicality, not because it violates the right to property, but because it violates the right to equality. And so no one honestly believes that zamindari abolition is under such serious threat that a constitutional amendment is needed. I mean, no less a person than the President of the Republic, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, writes to Nehru to tell him that no such eventuality seems to have arisen. But I think it's, again, just the temptation to take a shortcut, to have your own way because it's politically expedient. It sort of trumps, I feel it trumps the commitment to the kind of ideals that they publicly professed.
Yeah, and this was, of course, as you point out in your book, there are three prominent pain points in which the Constitution got in the way of what Nehru's government wanted to do, and this was one of them. Just to sort of get into the weeds and summarize briefly, and you can tell me if I'm summarizing it correctly. Well, it was, of course, challenged on the grounds of both the right to property and the right to equality, but the High Court, when striking it down in Bihar, invoked the right to equality per se, because, they were giving unequal compensation to the zamindars, in the sense that the small zamindars were getting up to 20 times their annual revenues, while others were getting 8 times, and some the biggest ones were getting 3 times or something like that, and which they felt infringed the right to equality. Is that correct? These were the grounds.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. And, you've quoted a bunch of letters that Nehru has written. On October 18, 1950, he wrote to Sri Krishna Sinha, who was CM of Bihar, where Nehru says, quote, "I am as concerned as you are with these squibblings of lawyers coming in the way of our social progress. I entirely agree with you that we shall have to consider seriously an amendment of the Constitution. I am consulting the Law Ministry in regard to it." Stop quote. And then again, you quote him in a letter to all his CMs on December 18th, where he says, quote, "Recent judgments of some high courts have made us think about our Constitution. Is it adequate in its present form to meet the situation we have to face. We must accept fully the judgment of our superior courts, but if they find that there is a lacuna in the constitution, then we shall have to remedy that. Stop quote. It sort of reminds me of, I think, the quip, I forget if it's by Brecht or whoever, that, if the people don't like the government, then the government shall have to elect a new people, something of that sort, where Nehru's perspective is, does the constitution fit what we want to do rather than the other way around? And like you pointed out, everyone was saying that nowhere have the courts actually said that zamindari reforms are an issue or land redistribution is an issue. It's very easy to be within the constitution and just revert the law a little bit to take care of these, but Nehru doesn't care to do that. So this is one of the fault lines. Tell me about the sort of the other two fault lines and, the key cases in sort of those regards.
So the other two fault lines, one, of course, is over reservations, community-based reservations, and the other, which is the fault line which the book begins with, is over, and I think something that's possibly the most relevant to the contemporary period, is the question of the right to freedom of speech, because we start with, I start the book with the case of the communist detainees in Salem, who are, there's a scuffle in Salem prison, and then finally the sort of enraged policemen lock these prisoners into a hole and then open fire at them at point blank range. And I think some 200 end up getting shot. And there are, I don't remember off the back of my head, but if I can...
I think you've pointed out how it kind of all begins where these detainees in Bombay, they realize after 26 Jan, the constitution comes into place, and these guys realize that according to Article 22, there cannot be indefinite detention
without access to a advisory board. And no such advisory boards existed. So obviously the Bombay High Court doesn't buy the government's contention that the constitution doesn't have retrospective effect or that law predates the constitution. And they're let loose. And of course, that's the kind of one of the first cases that brings, the fundamental rights into play. But then there's a kind of bigger question which comes up after the shootings of the detainees in Salem in cold blood, because there is a kind of there's a left-leaning magazine called Crossroads, run by the young Ramesh Thapar, who is coincidentally the brother of the famous historian Romila Thapar. But so Ramesh Thapar's magazine, eviscerates Nehru and the Congress, and it ends up getting banned in the Madras province. And Thapar, of course, is not one to take it lying down. He launches a collection. His readers sort of contribute to the effort, and eventually a petition is filed in the Supreme Court, arguing that the ban is unconstitutional. And it's mirrored on the other side in Delhi, where a pre-censorship order is served against the Organizer, which is the weekly news magazine of the RSS. And essentially the reason the government is upset with them is that they have been criticizing the Nehru government's policies towards Pakistan in the context of what's been happening in Bengal. Bengal had been seeing a lot of communal violence, triggered mainly by a sort of state-sponsored, I wouldn't necessarily call it a kind of genocide, but sort of state-sponsored communal attrition really in East Pakistan, which had led to a lot of refugees crossing over, and obviously retaliatory violence in West Bengal. So Nehru had been trying to essentially work out a kind of agreement with Liaquat Ali Khan on how they would stem the tide of the refugees. And Nehru's peace overtures to Pakistan were heavily criticized in Bengal. They were very unpopular, and as expected, they were also very unpopular with the Hindu right, with the RSS. And so the RSS news magazine was criticizing him heavily. Many right-leaning public figures, such as Mukherjee, and someone like the Hindu Mahasabha leader Mahant Digvijayanath were kind of clamoring for some sort of stern action against Pakistan, and this kind of demand for stern action saw wide echo everywhere, even within the Congress Party. There are letters from Nehru who suspects that this kind of viewpoint is being encouraged by Patel, and so finally he kind of demands action, and obviously action is taken. A pre-censorship order is passed, and the Brij Bhushan, who's the sort of printer and publisher of the organizer, and K.R. Malkani, who's then the editor, again take the matter up to the Supreme Court, and a kind of petition is filed. And both cases are heard kind of concurrently in the Supreme Court, which finally gives out its judgment in May. And they're both now quite well-known cases, Brij Bhushan versus the State of Delhi and Ramesh Thapar versus the State of Madras. And the court's judgment basically lays out quite clearly that the ability of the state to abridge the right to free speech was limited to the exceptions that had already been written into the Constitution, which were libel, slander, defamation, contempt of court, or undermining the security of the state. But the undermining of the security of the state had to create essentially was quite a high standard. It had to be undermined to the extent where disorder was of such a magnitude that it imperiled the security of the state, or like it had the potential to overthrow the state. And obviously, this did not reach that standard. So the court not only countermanded both orders, it also held the relevant parts of the legislations that we use, the Public Safety and Public Security Acts, to be ultra-virus. And that kind of really threw the government's point off, because Patel obviously, as he told Nehru, it kind of knocks the bottom line out of our ability to really control the press. But for Nehru, it was an even bigger problem, because he thought that this was something being done to undermine his peace overture to Pakistan, or to, in a way, for example, he writes to Rajagopalachari and he tells him, all of this is propaganda to try and push and bully me into war. And it's a war that he doesn't want to have. And it's curious to note that this is a demand that is also made within certain sections of the Congress Party and his government. Because eventually when his finance minister, John Mathai, resigns, John Mathai becomes one of the first people really to publicly describe Nehru's policies towards Pakistan as appeasement. And he becomes the kind of one of the first users of that term. And for Nehru, this sort of criticism of his Pakistan policy, he sees it as effectively a tool being used to undermine his overture to Pakistan. He suspects that there is support for that position within the Congress. He, as I note in the book, he berates Patel, telling him that his actions haven't been enough. And I quote, Nehru obviously writes to Patel, not completely satisfied with what is going on. I think we have taken up far too lenient an attitude towards those in India who encourage this communal feeling of hatred and violence. The Hindu Mahasabha talks about Akhand Bharat, which is a direct incentive to conflict. The belief that retaliation is a suitable method to deal with Pakistan or what happens in Pakistan is growing. That is the surest way to ruin for India and Pakistan. And even Patel, who has self-confessedly been deferring to Nehru on this matter, is kind of taken aback by Nehru's criticism. And he notes, again I quote, action has been circumscribed only by the provisions of the law as interpreted by our legal advisers and the high courts. We put thousands in jail and adopted a policy of release only after we were continually attacked on the score of maintaining civil liberties. And then he reminds Nehru, we are now faced with a constitution which guarantees fundamental rights, right of association, right of free movement, free expression, and personal liberty, which further circumscribe the action we can take. That means that for every executive action there must be legal justification. If within these limits you feel that our policy towards communal organizations has been lenient, steps can certainly be taken in the manner you may suggest. This exchange is a kind of good indication of how seriously this sort of criticism of his Pakistan policy was affecting Nehru, or how determined he was to find a way to kind of, if not crush it, at least to really smother it as far as he could. And then, of course, the second point of pain was the question of reservations, which had.
But can I, while we're on the subject, can I ask a sort of a tangential question which arose from something you wrote during this time? One, I just want to sort of point out to my listeners some of the dates involved, because, Tripurdaman, you mentioned about how you were sort of taken in by the phrase of a narrative going as fast as a bullet. And my jaw dropped open when I saw how fast the courts actually worked in that time. Like you point out that, the Constitution comes on January 26, 1950. On Feb 6, these communist detainees in Bombay file a case, and they are freed on Feb 8. In 2 days, they are free. And on Feb 11th, the other communist detainees in Salem start their whole thing, which ends with, the deaths of the 22 people, and that gets a crossroads to write about that, and Nehru defends the state action, at which point I was struck by this quote by Jayaprakash Narayan. And if you forget who is talking about who, there are echoes of this which reverberate to this time, where Jayaprakash Narayan says of Nehru, quote, "The Prime Minister of India talked in the language of dictators when he maintained that we had to choose between security of the state and freedom of the individual. We must choose the former." Stop quote. And later on, K.R. Malkani, the editor of The Organizer, which is the RSS mag, which, wins a case against the pre-censorship order against it. He writes, quote, "To threaten the liberty of the press for the sole offense of non-conformity to official view in each and every matter may be a handy tool for tyrants, but is only a crippling curtailment of civil liberties in a free democracy. A government can always learn more from bona fide criticism of independent thinking citizens than the fulsome flattery of charlatans." Stop quote. And later on, you, in referring to the case by The Organizer, which was, fought by N.C. Chatterjee, you write about the case, quote, "This case in itself was curious, succinct and informative, and an example of a great tradition of liberal thought within the Hindu nationalist movement that now seems to have been lost and forgotten." Stop quote. And you didn't elaborate on this in the book because the book is about something else entirely. But I nevertheless want to go on this tangent and ask you about this tradition of liberal thought within the Hindu nationalist movement, and why is it lost and forgotten as you describe it? What is your sense of it?
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because there were several quotes. Of course, there's that one by Malkani. And
I mean, there are many quotes by Shyama Prasad Mukherjee where he is very eloquently defending the right to free speech and the fundamental rights and all of that. But I'm more interested by what you term the liberal tradition within the sort of the Hindu nationalist movement.
Yeah. So, I mean, I mention it in the context of this because it's interesting that both Crossroads and The Organizer basically criticize the Nehru government along similar sort of pathways. They criticize them for being heavy-handed, for trampling on civil liberties, for not taking oppositional views on board, for encouraging ideological conformity, and they criticize them using a kind of terminology that we would now recognize as quite distinctly liberal. So respect for individual freedom, respect for the right to free speech, tolerance of dissent and criticism. These are profoundly liberal virtues. And this argument is made by K.R. Malkani in his columns. This argument is made by N.C. Chatterjee, who, again, by the way, is a former sort of Hindu Mahasabha stalwart, in his submissions in court. And this argument is made by Shyama Prasad Mukherjee in his interventions in Parliament. And all sort of frame their arguments in these terms. Now, there is, I'm sure a lot of people would say that that's just what was expedient at the time, and this is just a matter of a kind of using the constitutional defenses that you have to have your own way, and that's perfectly. I'm sure there was an element of that, but equally, it to me looks like a kind of distinct liberal tradition, because you have all the kind of both the political element of it and the kind of how should I put it, the ideological element, because for want of a better word, I mean, the organizer does represent the official viewpoint of the RSS. And what comes across to me is a kind of element of liberal thought which should realistically have been nourished and encouraged rather than clamped down on. And that's, I think, one of the more unfortunate parts of the whole story of the First Amendment is the fact that the sort of Nehru dispensation is willing to countenance the use of distinctly illiberal legal and constitutional tools to clamp down on a kind of ideological position that, while kind of discredited in the Nehruvian era, did nevertheless consistently enjoy a sort of reasonable modicum of public support. And I think that's something that, as a statesman, he should have seen through, or it's a kind of tradition that I feel should have been encouraged. Equally, it's a kind of tradition that is lost because the ideological and political successes of these people who are now, I mean, if you ever see the inside of a BJP office, you will always have a huge portrait of Shyam Prasad Mukherjee. But even within that stream of thought, people have really forgotten, or maybe deliberately ignored, the fact that Mukherjee was not the kind of bigoted authoritarian figure that people might imagine him to be. He was, in many ways, a sort of textbook case of classical liberalism. So that's a very, very interesting part of the story with tremendous contemporary relevance.
Yeah, I mean, even before reading your book, whenever I've come across like the Mukherjee-Nehru debates in the sort of Constituent Assembly debates and the debates they had during the First Amendment, it always struck me that, if you just reproduce a dialogue and you blank out the names, it would appear that it is definitely Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, who is a great liberal, and a Nehru, who is a dictatorial despot, as it were. And here also it strikes me that, like, one thing which is, I think certainly true is that it's very easy to appear virtuous in opposition, because you can say whatever, but you can do all the signaling in the right ways. Like, we don't even have to go as far back as Shyama Prasad. Even pre the 2014 elections, Narendra Modi was making a lot of noises which would please liberals, especially about downsizing government, minimum government, maximum governance, and the government has no business to be in business, and all of those things. And obviously his actions have gone in the opposite direction, but he was making a lot of noises. Even, Salman Soz of the Congress was on my show, and he said that even he approved of a lot of the rhetoric. So when Modi came to power, even Salman in the Congress was cautiously optimistic that he'll actually deliver on some of those things. But the imperatives of actually being in government seem to me to be quite different from the imperatives of, being in opposition. For example, when you are in that position of responsibility where you have to sort of juggle 100 different things and, and actually get things done, is there then a battle between pragmatism and principles which plays out? Where, a Sardar Patel can say that it is okay for you to say whatever you want sitting where you are, but I have the responsibility of being the home minister, and therefore security does matter. And you can leave your security freedom debate elsewhere, but I have to keep the country together. And these are, of course, in the fraught times after there has been so much trouble bringing the country together in the first place. So is that always a constant tussle where those who are in the opposition will always seem more virtuous than those in the government, because you are judging those in the government by their actions while you're judging those in opposition by their words?
Yeah, I mean, there's to a certain extent that's true, and there are Patel often makes the case that as the kind of person responsible for the nation's security, there are things that just need to be done. But equally, I think it's there's more happening than that, and the reason that comes through with the kind of internal opposition that is triggered within the Congress party, and that comes from the sort of indications that things are not. Obviously, there's often a gap between the ideals that nations and governments and political parties profess and the imperatives of government, but that things are not really going as had been imagined. That there are plenty of indications to it. Those indications come from the speaker at some point where he writes to Nehru, for example, to say to express his disapproval of the frequent recourse to the use of presidential ordinances. It comes from sort of dissident congressmen like figures like Acharya Kripalani. Now, of course, people can make the case that Kripalani was upset because he hadn't been made a minister and he hadn't won the election to the Congress presidency, and he was kind of sidelined. And perhaps some of his criticism did come from there. But if we are to kind of constantly simply assume an ulterior motive or a motive driven solely by realpolitik, I think that would also be a bit unfair. And the fact that perhaps it was easy for Malkani and Mukherjee, etc., to deploy the kind of rhetoric of liberalism while not being saddled with the responsibility of government. And in truth, we can never really have a firm answer to that question. But there are plenty of indications that even within the Congress, there was disquiet at the way things were being done. And you get that from quite senior, quite pivotal figures, from Rajendra Prasad, from Acharya Kripalani, from G.V. Mavlankar, and indeed from some dissidents who kind of speak up during the debate. And some of the things that are often said both by Nehru and by other figures within the Congress establishment quite shocking, if not at least surprising, if not shocking, to read. Because you have figures like Hare Krishna Mehta, who basically tells Nehru that the real culprits are actually things such as the right to equality itself, which shouldn't be there. So there's a kind of disquiet within the Congress, which would, I think, give some credence, at least some reason for us to give figures like Mukherjee a kind of, if not 100% of our indulgence, at least 50% of our indulgence.
And also, Mukherjee was part of the cabinet and he did quit in protest. So, he could just have stayed a minister had he wanted. Let's take a quick commercial break and then come back to continue exploring the fault lines that led to the First Amendment of the Indian Constitution. On the seen and the unseen, I often speak about positive sum games. Well, if you want to be surrounded by beauty and you love fine art, I have a win-win proposition for you. Head on over to IndianColors.com. Indian Colors licenses images of fine art from some of the best contemporary artists in India and adapts them to objects of everyday use like tote bags, pouches, and home decor items. You get to surround yourself with the finest modern Indian art at affordable prices, and artists get royalties for every product you buy. Win-win game. The Indian Colors new range is in and includes elegant yet comfortable dresses for women and casual shirts for men with standout motifs by artists such as Tanmoy Samunta, Manisha Gera Baswari, Shruti Nelson, Pradeep Mishra, and Jaideep Mehrotra. Stay home, but dress smart. And if you're missing your friends in these lockdown days, worry not. You can show them you're thinking of them by buying gifts for them from Indian Colors. Corporate gifting is also available. So head on over to IndianColors.com, that's colors with an OU, and make art a part of your life. And hey, for a 15% discount, use the code UNSEEN. That's right, UNSEEN for 15% off at IndianColors.com. Welcome back to The Seen and the Unseen. I'm chatting with the historian Tripurdaman Singh about his fabulous a book where the narrative goes as fast as a bullet, 16 stormy days. And, while Tripurdaman's book, the narrative does go as fast as a bullet, my show is a little bit more leisurely, which is why we have reached the break and we have only finished two of the three fault lines that kind of led to the First Amendment being felt necessary by Jawaharlal Nehru. Two of them, to quickly recap, are, of course, that he wanted to enact zamindari reforms, and that was struck down by the Bihar High Court, and was, there was litigation in other places, and the Bihar High Court struck it down on the grounds of the right to equality, but it was also sort of challenged on the right to property. And even though experts felt that you could have redrafted those laws and got them through and made them constitutional, Nehru was a man in a hurry. The second, of course, is the free speech laws. Now, we think of Article 19(1), I certainly do, as, being, the opposite of the pristine First Amendment of the US Constitution, which sanctifies free speech. But in this particular case, it has a bunch of caveats. And the interesting thing is that the original Constitution enacted on 26 Jan 1950 had some of these caveats, but the First Amendment brought in a bunch more, like public order and so on, which can be left open to the interpretation of governments. And there was a fault line there because he banned Crossroads, which was a communist magazine, and he tried to impose pre-censorship on the organizer, the RSS magazine. Both of those fine parties went to court, and the law moved a little bit quicker than it does today, and both of them won. So Nehru's also now thinking, okay, not just right to property, not just right to equality, there's also right to free speech. Where's the third fault line, Tripurdaman? Tell me a bit about how that came about.
Sure. Just before I move on to that, a quick kind of detour back to what we were talking about was, I think, when I mentioned that there was disquiet within the kind of Congress establishment as well, I think the most important indication of this, as early as April 1950, comes from Sardar Patel, whose letter to Nehru I quoted, where he, kind of reminds him of the fact that whatever they have to do has to be within constitutional bounds. And now Patel is quite ambivalent about his commitment to expansive free speech, and he obviously he once does note to Nehru that they will have to consider amendments to the Constitution at some point, or that the sort of right to free speech was the result of idealistic exuberance. But Patel's letter is also a kind of, its tone is very sarcastic. It, notes things which, it's basically telling Nehru things that, you would expect a grade 6 student studying civics to know. And so I would see that as a kind of indication that even Patel did somewhere think that what Nehru was asking him to do was to essentially set aside constitutional bounds and contemplate action that would quite clearly breach constitutional norms. So I think knowing that, we have to be willing to give some benefit of the doubt to figures like Malkani and Mukherjee. Obviously, we can never quite know what they would have done in government, but we can give them some benefit of the doubt to say that the position that they were taking up were not simply the result of realpolitik, but also of some sort of ideological conviction.
No, in fact, I should clarify that when I phrased that earlier question, I did not mean to cynically imply that, in opposition, you will be virtuous only because you're in opposition and vice versa. But there are complex currents in the affairs of men. So, people do things for multifactorial reasons, many of which they themselves might not be aware of. So, while I think in general we should take people at face value unless we have reason to believe otherwise, and at the same time, as a friend of mine likes saying, assume goodwill. So, there's no reason to do otherwise with either Malkani or Shama Prasad Mukherjee or Jayaprakash Narayan or, any of the eminences who kind of oppose the amendment. And while we are on the subject, I'll quickly quote from your book to show what a wide range of opposition there was to Nehru at this time, where you write, quote, Hindu nationalists like S.V. Mukherjee and M.R. Jayakar, Gandhian stalwarts like Acharya Kripalani, committed socialists like Shibban Lal Saxena and Jayaprakash Narayan, conscientious Congress rebels like H.V. Kamant, Swanandan Sahai and K.K. Bhattacharya, jurists like Prannath Mehra and M.C. Chagla, press associations, editors, lawyers and businessmen, men whose ideological and editorial successors today might scarcely believe, but would do well to remember that their predecessors held the views they did. Stop quote. And while you brought Patel in, I was also kind of, before we get to the sort of the third fault line, I was also struck by a quote about Nehru and Patel, which I thought I'll ask you about later, but as we are on the subject now, where you wrote, quote, their commitment to civil liberties and individual freedom, or the lack thereof, represented a rare consensus between the two giants of Indian politics. Stop quote. Who would have thunk? And I guess their skepticism towards fundamental rights, which, as you pointed out, Patel at one point said reflected, quote, idealistic exuberance, I guess would have come for different reasons. For Patel, it would have been that, look, I have a tough job to do, the security at stake, there is, we take the nation for granted today. At the time Patel was Home Minister, he had just managed to cobble it together almost in a new act of imperialism, as it were, and the priority was to hold it together and the rights were in the way. While for Nehru, to be honest, he had been consistent all his political life about his values being social progressivism and all of the things that went along with that, like zamindari reforms and so on. And again, the constitution was sort of an impediment to that. Is that sort of a correct characterization, that they were coming from a different place, which was, and the constitution was a separate thing. And today we talk about the constitution and the values it embodies as almost holy and sacramental. But in those tumultuous times, it would not have had the place it did, even in the minds of those who drafted it.
You're right. I mean, there was a kind of sense of consensus between them on the constitution, but they did approach it, as you rightly point out, from different angles. And perhaps, yes, it didn't really have the kind of same sense of sanctity that it seems to have now, at least. I mean, I'm not sure how much sanctity it really has, but at least in the public mind, a kind of sanctity attaches to it. But it's interesting to note that when the Constitution first comes into force, everyone gives a statement saying, yes, we have to maintain the sanctity of the Constitution, etc., etc. But on the other hand, when the amendment finally reaches Parliament and it's criticized for the fact that it's being amended so soon without a general election, by an unelected body, Nehru points a kind of response by saying that since we were competent to make it, we should be competent to amend it as well. And I think that kind of just supports what you said, really, that they saw it as almost as something that was there as a kind of vehicle towards a particular end, perhaps rather than an end in itself. And that end, nobody was quite sure of, because for Nehru, that end represented a kind of particular kind of social progressivism. For others, it represented a kind of, I think especially for Rajendra Prasad, it represented a kind of stable property order. And for quite others, it represented a kind of liberal democracy as they had come to expect by looking at what had happened in Europe and America. And so nobody, I think, because there was no real kind of consensus on what exactly the end was, people saw it as a vehicle towards a particular end, but they didn't quite agree on what that end really was.
So can I ask you a broader question now that I'd actually save for the end, but again, we are sort of on the subject, which is, two broader questions really. And the first one is about just this notion of what India should be, sort of the competing early ideas of India, which can even merge into one idea of India. But, as you've shown in your book, they can mean different things. And one is, of course, the sort of democracy Nehru had in mind, which would aim at a particular kind of social equality and social justice and so on and all of those things. And at the same time, a constitutional republic where you would be bound by certain rules of the game, which would constrain the behavior of the state and circumscribe what the state could do to its citizens. And it seems to me that at the heart of this, there is an inherent contradiction. And that contradiction has very much to do with how you think of means versus ends. While where Nehru's thinking was that, look, my ends are that these are the things I want to achieve and these are my means of doing so. And one could, even argue that even those means are flawed because they are based on top-down thinking and they didn't actually get anywhere. But regardless, that could be his way of looking at it. While the constitutional way of thinking would be that the means are everything. That you have to protect individual rights, you have to respect individual autonomy. The citizen is a master of the state and not the other way around. And that's where all the fundamental rights come up. So do you think that there is, and to me it seems that, your book describes a period of time where the people in power are at the heart of this conflict and they are choosing their democratic ends over constitutional means, and to do this they're completely subverting the constitution. And I mean, I really think we as your book kind of makes explicit, we had a real liberal constitution for perhaps 14 months of our history, and after that we didn't. It's a periodical and whoever is in power does whatever the hell they want with it. So to your end, is this a tragic outcome that the two went in different directions, or is that conflict something that simply cannot be negotiated? It's just, between being a democracy, what the popular will of the people is, and constitutional values per se.
I mean, I think, but at some level, that conflict is kind of inherent in any sort of democratic setup, because the temptation to do certain things or to kind of take shortcuts is always there. And one of the arguments that's often deployed is that part and parcel of a democratic system is to reflect the will of the people. And Nehru deploys this argument, I think, in a flawed manner, because obviously has been no democratic mandate yet, by saying that the legislature has to decide on matters of social policy, and wherever the constitution comes in the way of the will of the people, then obviously the constitution has to give way. So that I don't think you can completely avoid that conflict anywhere. But the answers that you reach, or the sort of mechanisms that are devised to mediate that conflict, I mean, ultimately that's where all of the action is. And Nehru's view very much is of a kind that one would, for example, expect somewhere like Britain, where parliamentary sovereignty is kind of expansive, and there is no written constitution. So whatever Parliament does is, ipso facto, it is constitutional. Whereas a written constitution, by its very nature, is meant to contain and circumscribe the actions of the branches of government, or the branches of the state, rather. And that's kind of... I recently read political theorist Madhav Khosla's book on the Constitution. And again, that's one of the arguments that he makes, is that one of the reasons that the Constitution is so lengthy was because they didn't simply want to delineate general principles, but to kind of contain and guide the actions of future legislators, judges, and politicians in a particular direction. And that's one of the reasons why the Constitution goes into so much detail. And it's a point that Mukherjee makes repeatedly when the amendment is introduced into Parliament, saying that the very fact that if this is what we wanted to do, then we should not have had a written constitution in the first place. Having a written constitution, especially one as detailed as ours, comes with a set of implications, which means that you are constrained in what you can do. And yes, there is a kind of system of amendment, but even for that system of amendment to be, kind of scrupulously followed, you have to have an election and two elected houses of parliament. And so that conflict can't be avoided, but the conclusions that Nehru came to certainly could have been, and there were plenty of people who disagreed with it. And I think, in my opinion, they were right. I'm sure probably were others who felt differently. But once you normalize, and again, if I can just go to the Mukherjee's retort to Nehru really makes clear, where he says, you may be in power for this generation or for generations unborn, but supposing someone else comes into government, what is the precedent that you're laying down? And that's, I think, one of the most unfortunate consequences is that once you create a precedent and an avenue for something to be done, there's really nothing stopping someone else from utilizing the same mechanisms to the opposite effect. And that's kind of how, and Mukherjee has been proven true, I think.
Yeah, no, I have three kind of observations here. One is I had done an episode with Gyan Prakash on the emergency, and the point he made there, and you've also quoted him in your book, is that, look, what Indira Gandhi did in 75, calling the emergency, was not unconstitutional or extraordinary. It was delineated in the powers given to the state. Those extreme powers were given to the state, and that's in the design of the state, which to a large extent remains. The second thought that strikes me is that in this position that Nehru is taking in constitutional morality versus democracy, and I agree with you that he took the wrong position. And in this position that he is taking, you could argue that in the long run, he is laying down the roots of a Hindu Rashtra. Because if our society is such that the kind of dispensation that is in power today will one day get into the government, if you follow Nehru's argument to its logical end, then that means that these guys would be correct to change the constitution to reflect what they feel is a popular mandate that they have got. And many of the people from, Nehru's party today would sort of perhaps not recognize that, but that's a logical end of Nehru's own kind of actions. And, one common question that I often ask my guests, so much so that it's almost become a cliche, and I'm sure you've heard it in past episodes, is about this odd paradox of our constitution, which is, and let's go to the original 1950 constitution and imagine that the First Amendment isn't there yet, and which is of a relatively liberal constitution being imposed on an illiberal society. And, then how liberal can that imposition be, that a group of unelected elites, as it were, are sitting and saying that these are the values that we shall live by? And this is something that, I feel conflicted about, because those values, of course, I agree with. But at the same time, I can't square that circle and say that why should I, the core part of my value system is that I shall not impose my values on others. So, how does one square that circle? What are your sort of thoughts on this?
Interesting question. There is one very revealing quote. I'm not sure who said it in the Constituent Assembly, but someone said, we were expecting the sounds of the veena and we got the sounds of an orchestra or some. It's something like that. Essentially, many people felt that the Constitution wasn't rooted in a kind of in the social milieu in which it was being born, and again, I kind of quote. I'm quoting Madhav Khosla here because his is the most recent and study of the Constitution. The argument is that the Constitution in itself is a kind of pedagogic document. So by practicing what the Constitution is giving, you will be creating a kind of democratic citizen rather than there being a kind of popular upsurge which results in the Constitution. And it's an interesting argument to make, because there is a sense that's what people thought. But equally, it's, people are not very willing to be kind of educated in that way. And everyone kind of recognized that, and Ambedkar most prominently recognized that what was happening was that you were creating a kind of, in his words, sort of democratic topsoil based on the sort of subsoil of an undemocratic society. And it was an experiment. It was, most constitutional scholars, journalists, etc., everybody noted that it was a kind of brave and great experiment in democratic government. And that's one of the things that makes it so exceptional, is the fact that it was a kind of leap of faith. But having committed themselves to it, the mistake that India's sort of early post-colonial elite made is the same that the British made when they first introduced provincial popular legislatures in the provinces, is that once you introduce a kind of democratic system or a constitutional system, you have to be at some level willing to bear the consequences that accrue. And that was something that the Indian elite was unwilling to do. Now, we can make the case that there was, as Nehru tried to make, that there was a kind of grave threat to national security, to public order, and we can debate whether there was, but equally there are as many important figures who refuse to believe that such a thing existed, that there was such a grave threat. So I think squaring that kind of circle requires a certain broad-based commitment to the constitutional ideal that was, I think, not quite present even within the Congress Party, and that's, I think, we're still kind of struggling to really square that circle, because we've, in a way, uncorked a genie almost with the First Amendment, and obviously now it's been amended about 105 times, I think, possibly even more, and we're now at a point where without kind of going back to and redeveloping a sort of consensus on constitutional first principles, really, it's difficult to even contemplate squaring that circle, because if you ask the two sides of the political divide, they have almost completely diametrically opposite readings of what the Constitution is and what what it represents. And to square that is, I mean, it's quite a difficult proposition.
I mean, now, as you said, it's a done deal. By the way, I mean, people don't realize this. People often express shock and horror when they think of the BJP wanting to amend the constitution. But, as I mentioned earlier, there was that old cartoon about how it's not a book, but a periodical.
Mm-hmm.
And the economist Shruti Rajagopalan, who's a frequent guest on the show, had once given a talk on YouTube, which I'll link to, where she talks about all the different amendments under Nehru to begin with. So,
Mm-hmm.
some people have this impression that, hey, the amendments and the messing around started with Indira Gandhi and Nehru was a constitutionalist, and that's just rubbish, as your book and subsequent events also show. The other thing that I'm kind of struck by, to sort of continue thinking aloud and be on a tangent, is that what we often have, what disturbs me today, especially about politics, is that politics has, and I imagine it was, I would have thought it was less so in Nehru's time, but who knows? But what it has become is that it is tribal to the extent that people just care about which tribe they are part of and not about principles per se. So, you'll have people protesting about 153A and 295A when it's being used against one of their own, but they're quite happy to, see it used against somebody else, where, how you judge a policy really comes down to which side you're on and which side is carrying the policy out. Like in these recent farm bills, for example, I was, it's interesting how a lot of what has been enacted in these farm bills was part of the Congress manifesto in 2019.
Mm-hmm.
And they're protesting those very same things. And therefore it's become a politics of just tribalism of you pick your side and you go with it and not principles per se. And therefore it strikes me that no view that sort of really takes constitutionalism seriously is going to get any kind of traction, because people don't care about principles, even today. I mean, it's just about which side you're on, and then you say whatever, but in practice, you don't. I mean, this is a bit of an aside from me, I'm just thinking aloud, but what are sort of your thoughts on this? And going back to that time, was there a sense of it then, because the parties weren't so hardened and, different things from each other at the time?
Oh, you're right. They don't really think in terms of those sort of principles, but as the book bears out, they didn't seem to be thinking that strongly about principles, in 1951 either. And I think the way to really, and principles are, I feel like, quite a sort of top-down manner. The leaders have to demonstrate a commitment to constitutional morality if they expect it to kind of percolate downwards. And they just didn't, right from the word go. Again, in the context of the book, you have, at one point Nehru berate someone like K.V. Kamath, who, intervenes at some point, and he asks him not to quote things which are relevant at the time of the French Revolution and, the American Revolution. And so that was, I think, a pivotal moment in demonstrating that constitutional principles could be undone in pursuit of a obviously political agenda. In today's day and age, again, because it's something, I think each precedent kind of builds on what comes before. Things get normalized very, very quickly. Things that we, laws such as, 153A and 295A, as you mentioned, which we now take for granted as existing in the books, we often don't remember that, they were, as intended by the Constituent Assembly, these were not supposed to be allowed to continue. So it's, even back then, the situation was not drastically different. I mean, it was different to the extent that there was a sense of idealism, and a particular dispensation was in power and remained in power for a very long time. But I don't think it was very different in terms of attitudes or in terms of commitment to constitutional principles, because if the Constitution itself is malleable and changeable, it obviously can't lead to a kind of enduring legal norms if those norms themselves are subject to frequent change. I think that's kind of what I would say to that, really.
Yeah, and I'll again sort of quote from your book, because we are speaking about 153A and 295A, and there's also 124A, which is sedition.
Mm-hmm.
And you've pointed out in your book, quote, "Far from being a simple remnant of colonialism, sedition is an outcome of the First Amendment of the Constitution and the Nehru government's desire to clamp down on critical voices, unencumbered by constitutional obligations, a truly deliberate and strategic assault on the Constitution and fundamental rights." Stop quote. And so just clarify this for me, that my impression about these laws, 124A, 153A, 295A, was that any of the laws that are in the Indian Penal Code can be challenged if they are unconstitutional and struck down. And that is what would have happened in the case of these laws in the normal course of things. But the First Amendment added those other sort of caveats to free speech.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, these laws kind of remained in the book. And therefore, you're saying it's a responsibility of the First Amendment and Nehru, therefore, that we have the law of sedition with us. Is that correct?
That's true. And not only the idea that they would have been struck down, in fact, they were struck down, most prominently in the case of Master Tara Singh in Punjab, when he was charged with sedition, and the court held sedition to be unconstitutional. And sedition was, it was very clear that it was unconstitutional. It was very clear that the Constituent Assembly didn't want it. And they didn't want it especially because of its association with repression in the British period, because most of the Congress stalwarts had been charged with sedition and jailed. And it's a point they make repeatedly during the debate, that this was an act that was used against patriots and nationalists under British rule, and we can't be. We shouldn't be bringing it back on the books. But it was, yes, you're absolutely right. They were unconstitutional, and they were brought back. They were brought back for a particular end. We might say that, well, the ends that Nehru thought were benevolent or somehow justified, but they were brought back. I mean, it's perhaps hard to imagine now, but there was a period in time where these sections of the Indian Penal Code were unconstitutional. You could not be charged with sedition in the year 1950 because it was an unconstitutional part of the IPC. And I mean, I don't think Nehru alone is responsible, because obviously there have been plenty of opportunities to repeal it or replace it with something else, and they haven't been taken. But Nehru is responsible to the extent that he creates a set of legal tools which he describes kind of quite ironically as something that he wants to leave for the succeeding generations. And well, here we are.
And here we are indeed. So, your book goes like a bullet. This episode has been floating like a feather. So let's kind of get back to the narrative and get back to the third fault line. We've already spoken about the Zamindari reforms, which the fundamental rights came in the way of, the right to property and the right to equality. We've spoken about how he wanted to control the press, and the right to free speech came in the way of that. And what's the third fault line?
So the third fault line is reservations, and that, again, is something that begins in Madras, because, I mean, Madras had been, the erstwhile Madras province, had been a kind of crucible for social justice politics, with the creation of the Justice Party, the kind of appearance of Periyar, and the Justice Party had kind of enacted as all of these sort of mechanisms, social justice mechanisms, amongst which was something called the Communal General Order, which allocated government employment and access to government educational institutes in a particular ratio amongst communities. It was quite a peculiar instrument because what it did was it kind of allocated seats, for example, in a particular ratio. And so if the ratio was, I think it was something like for every 14 seats, 5 could be Brahmins and 3 would be something else. So there would only be 5 Brahmins. And it didn't matter if there was, it was almost a kind of ironclad quota, a kind of government-sanctioned distribution almost in a particular ratio rather than the way we understand reservations now. And so if only 7 Brahmins were allowed, then the number of Brahmins could not be greater than 7, for example. Or if the number of Harijans that were allowed was 6 out of 14, then they could not be 6 out of 14. It's not as if someone could get greater marks and go into another quota. So everyone was really subject to this system of quotas, and that was challenged by a woman named Champakam Durairajan, who had, interestingly, not even actually applied for admission, but wanted to apply for admission and had been effectively told that her grades wouldn't allow her in through the Brahmin quota. And obviously there were other people with lower grades who would get in from, their own community-based quotas. And so she kind of files a petition in the High Court in Madras. And the High Court in Madras, after it rouses quite a lot of passion because it's a kind of great, it's a question that, touches upon a lot of lives, and you have a lot of protests, etc. The court holds a kind of interesting position. So what the court effectively does is the court finds the Communal General Order unconstitutional, but what it also notes is that considerations of caste and community were not only not allowed, they were expressly taboo, and that's the kind of language. It's quite stern, the language that the court uses, and they keep saying basically that the right to equality and the right to freedom from discrimination will effectively become empty bubbles if the executive orders like the Communal General Order are allowed to be implemented or allowed to continue. So basically, again, an interesting aside, the petitioners were represented by the noted lawyer Alladi Krishnaswamy Iyer, who again had been one of the key architects of the Constitution and also someone who advised the government on the amendment, which nullified a court order that he himself had won, which I still find the kind of intellectual somersaults that many of these people perform to be quite interesting. But the Madras government basically submits in court. It never really argued that the quotas didn't amount to discrimination. What it said was, as a result of applying the ratio prescribed by the communal geo, 77 Brahmins, 224 non-Brahmins, 51 Christians, 26 Muslims, and 26 Harijans had been selected for admission to engineering colleges. If caste and community considerations had been ignored, the numbers would have been 249 Brahmins, 112 non-Brahmins, 22 Christians, 3 Muslims, and 0 Harijans. So to avoid this sort of system and to fulfill what they saw as their responsibility under the directive principles of state policy, they had created this order. But again, the court, and if you don't mind, I'll just quote from the court order again. What they say is, the communal geo denies equal treatment for all citizens under like circumstances and conditions, both in the privileges conferred and the disabilities imposed. It shuts out students having high qualifications solely on the grounds of their caste or religion, and lets in others with inferior qualifications on the same ground. As the articles of the Constitution stand at present, it is difficult to see how the state can make discrimination between applicant and applicant on the grounds of religion or caste, and restrict the number of seats that could be secured by applicants of any particular religion or caste, or prescribe different qualifications to applicants of different religions or castes to the advantage of some and the disadvantage of others. Does social justice or the welfare of the state require a suppression of the integrity and freedom of the individual personality of the citizen by reason of his belonging to a particular caste? And so the court is quite strict, and even when they end the judgment, and I quote again, if the person in charge for the time being of a state, elected no doubt by a majority of voters at the polls, were free to enforce their own notions of social and economic justice, unfettered by constitutional restraints, there is a possibility of serious and undeserved hardship and injury to large classes of citizens. Declaration of a guaranteed right in Article 15(1) of the Constitution would be worthless if the government could disregard or nullify it by executive acts like the Communal General Order. And so the court is, effectively what it is saying is that any form of consideration of caste or community or religion into questions about employment or education is expressly taboo, and what's basically prevented by the sort of chapter on fundamental rights cannot then be enabled through the back door by the chapter on directive principles. And again, what the courts delineate is a kind of bastion of, not really a bastion, but a kind of bedrock of constitutional thought, that fundamental rights effectively trump the directive principles of state policy. And this is something that the Nehru government doesn't completely agree with. And it's interesting to read Nehru's responses to this, because the directive principles of state policy are kind of a hodgepodge of all sorts of things, including, some concern education, some concern backward class welfare, but equally there are others which concern animal husbandry and the protection of cows. And if that, again, as something that we discussed earlier on, if, for example, someone was to take Nehru's position with respect to the article in the directive principles with regard to protection of cows, what could then, what it could lead to something, sort of consequences that we would today be right to question. So again, anyway, this judgment comes in. It really shocks the Madras government, because the Madras government is, this has been an article of faith in Madras. Initially, of course, the Congress had opposed it when it was the Justice Party doing it, but this kind of social justice politics had acquired deep roots in Madras, and the Congress government had continued with those policies. It was committed to reservations as an ideal. There was, crucially, again, the question of an election coming up. The Madras Congress was right in its fears that there was a possibility that it would lose. And so they were quite, this is something that caused a lot of agitation within Madras. Interestingly, this is a question out of like the three sort of fault lines that you mentioned. This is the one that Nehru was the least invested in. So even though there was plenty of pressure from Madras to completely override Article 15 and also, I think, Article 29, which prohibited discrimination in the matter of admissions to educational institutions receiving state aid. This was something that Nehru cast, was something specifically that Nehru was kind of loath to address, I would say. And so it's unlike the other two in which his mind is quite firmly made up. This third fault line takes a while to kind of build. There's pressure from Madras. The chief minister comes to Delhi to speak to him. Ministerial delegations from Delhi come to speak to him. Initially, Nehru's advice is for them to rewrite the Communal General Order to be in conformity with the Constitution. And but of course, eventually he comes around, and I think, and the literature on this is slightly hazy because it's something that is both, in a way, there is a kind of consensus that this state should be committed to the welfare of backward classes of citizens, and in a way there's no real clarity as to what it implies, because there had been no, unlike the question of the scheduled castes, which had been tackled in the Constitution, this was still a sort of work in progress. Nobody really knew what it was going to entail or who was going to kind of be classified as a backward class, what criteria would be used. So some of the opposition that came, of course, to the amendment did note that there was no clarity on this. There was no real way to tell what the consequences would be, and no way to really tell whether it would be misused by the state, although many suspected that it would be misused by the state. So this is, I think, the kind of strand that in which Nehru was less the driving force and more the kind of I think his role was more or less like he wasn't against it, but it was not something that he was strongly concerned with. So I think it just the fact that the three things kind of came together sort of provided him with an opportunity to, create the constitutional architecture for something that they might want to do in the future. And just as a sort of last point, this is something that's not very clear in their correspondence, but I would suspect that it was one of the sort of ways where how someone like Ambedkar was brought to agree with the whole amendment, like with the whole sort of broad contours of the amendment, because we know that Ambedkar was not quite in agreement with the strand of it that targeted free speech, for example. And so I think it might also have been a way of kind of sort of neutralizing dissent by bringing in several elements into one package, really.
So let me kind of try to parse and put in simple terms what this particular judgment would have meant and what the court's point of view would be, and you can tell me if I'm summarizing it correctly. Is that the court basically referred to the fundamental right of equality and said that, look, the state has to treat everyone equally. That means the state cannot discriminate on the basis of caste. And hey, these reservations are in this discrimination on the basis of caste. Now, you might justify it in this instance saying this is my lofty goal and this is how this will let me get there, and that is an entirely separate argument. I mean, today, of course, reservations are conflated with caring about caste. So it's deeply politically incorrect to make an argument that there are better ways to get rid of caste, and reservations might actually be a top-down thing that make them worse or can be misused. But leave that aside. Even if it is a tool that would work, the point that they're making is that once you give in to the temptation of infringing this fundamental right of equality for whatever reason, then what is to stop a popular government in the future from also infringing it for some reason of their own in some other way that they deem fit? And therefore, it is better that we hold it as sacrosanct and just stick to it. Would that be a correct summation?
Yeah, I think that was more or less the court's reasoning. They were quite certain, and they say it quite clearly, that if any government elected by a majority of the voters were allowed to have, put their own considerations, express their own considerations through these sort of executive acts, then the entire, Article 15 of the Constitution would effectively become worthless. And those are the court's words. So that's a correct summation of the position. Interestingly, one of the sort of questions that comes up is, how do you define social and educational backwardness? Are the two, synonymous? And how much of a consideration is caste, and how much of a consideration are other questions? And one of the key points of the amendment is that it leaves out any mention of economic circumstances. So the only way, what it effectively did was that only way in which such backwardness could be judged was on the basis of caste. So economic considerations were expressly disallowed. And so that in itself has led to the kind of, it's that debate in itself carries on now in questions or in issues about, like, for example, the idea of the creamy layer that, it comes up every time a question about reservations reaches the courts, about how do you exclude people who are supposedly socially backward but economically well-to-do. And many of these debates go back to this moment in time. And so again, on the question of Article 15, when the amendment was discussed within the cabinet, there's a rare sort of consensus on what should be done, because from Madras, the idea is that there should be alteration of Article 15, but also Article 29, which had prevented discrimination in the matter of admissions to educational institutes. And they basically wanted an amendment to the effect stating that nothing in either Article 15 or Article 29(2) would prevent special provisions for the educational, economic, and social advancement of the backward classes. And the cabinet, I think most were of the belief, or at least that's what was expressed, that there was, this could not be misused for any class discrimination that was against the spirit of the Constitution. There was, I think, broad-based consensus that the spirit of the Constitution implied that measures were taken for social justice, measures were taken for kind of the advancement of backward classes. But again, I'm just going to quote directly from my book. In a new twist, the cabinet also recommended that all references to economic and economically be dropped, and the language be limited to socially and educationally backward classes. Through this sleight of hand, the cabinet sought to achieve two objectives. First, it would remove any prospect of economic criteria coming in the way of calculating the backwardness of a class based on their social and educational standing. Second, it would preempt and negate any demands for special provisions or reservations for those who could be termed economically backward without the corresponding status of social or educational backwardness. So basically, they wanted power to legislate for reservations, but equally they wanted to prevent a kind of open-ended, almost race to the bottom, because as KV Kamath, quite pointedly intervenes in the debate, and he says on the question of backwardness, well, 90% of the country is backward, and there is no way of really differentiating who's educationally and socially backward through the use of the lens of caste and community. But of course, I mean, that was not a popular position, and so the exclusion of economic backwardness from the kind of ambit of India's reservation policy is again something that can be traced back to the First Amendment. And I think, again, the cabinet and many of the parliamentarians were not quite certain as to how the process or the policy of reservations was going to be developed, because it was something that had yet to really be, finalized. I think the first Backward Class Commission was appointed much after this. So I think today, many of the questions that we would consider today, questions about before the 29 elections, of course, the government announced a kind of reservation policy for economically weaker sections. And of course, the question of the creamy layer within the backward classes keeps cropping up. And again, that's a question that goes back to the First Amendment. And I think it's one of the most interesting sort of fault line of the three. It's possibly the most interesting, because at the time it also seems to be the least important. The least amount of attention is paid to it.
Except in the South, where Periyar railed against the judgment in rallies, and the Times of India, wrote about, quote, crusaders for a separate Dravidistan are once again on the march, stop quote. And I imagine this would also have sort of put pressure on Nehru that, the center must hold, and these political imperatives also matter, along with all the factors you mentioned before, such as, maybe keeping Ambedkar enthusiastic was part of the mix. So now that, all these three fault lines have come together, and you've repeatedly quoted Nehru at different parts of the book, basically shitting on the Constitution, saying that, hey, we need to kind of, if the Constitution isn't going along with us, then we must change the Constitution. And you sum it up very well here. So I'll quickly quote this book where you write, at the time of the, just before the First Amendment is happening.
Mm-hmm.
You write, quote, the Prime Minister was essentially making three claims. First, that the failure of the Congress social agenda when confronted with the Constitution should be regarded as an intolerable situation. Since he did not want to face the populace and be accused of breaching his promise, the Constitution would have to give way to the primacy of the Congress program. Second, that the social policies devised by elected legislatures, sites of popular sovereignty, being held unconstitutional by the courts was a denial of democracy, even if the legislatures had been elected on a distinctly limited and narrow franchise. In true democratic spirit, the Constitution would have to bend to accommodate the will of the people as represented by a legislature elected indirectly and on a limited franchise. Third, the three pillars of the state, the judiciary, the executive, and the legislature, were not equal. The executive was to create and give effect to social policy, and it was to have primacy over the other wings of the state, especially the judiciary. It was a slippery slope. Stop quote. And separately, in an interview, you've spoken about how the First Amendment showed the judiciary its place. Mm-hmm. So what is the process like now? So, he wants to, his own cabinet members like Ambedkar, Rajaji, and whoever are on board with him. And Patel, dies in December 1950. And the First Amendment actually goes for all the voting happens in May 51. Mm-hmm. So what's happening? You've spoken about all the opposition leaders kind of gathered around in, but what's the overall what's happening in the political space? Like if Republic TV existed, what would they be showing? They would still be showing film stars taking drugs, actually. So cancel that question. But yeah.
Interesting that you mentioned what the media would be showing, because if you were to simply go by Nehru's utterances, the media didn't seem to be all that different back in the day, even though we know it was. But Nehru consistently rails against the media, and one of the things he keeps saying, is what will be the effect on our soldiers, and what will be the effect on our youth of reading this trash. So I think he might have probably written the same thing about Republic. But to go back to your question, Nehru makes this claim, the sort of three claims that you mentioned, and he makes them quite strongly. So there is a letter where he basically says that the job of the government is no longer simply to make policy; it is now to basically direct social change and to see it through. And he's firmly committed to that line. Politically, things kind of progressively reach at least what he thinks as a kind of difficult time, because Zamindari abolition is something that he's very committed to. Post Patel's death, there is no real challenger within the Congress establishment, and as the sort of new year kind of opens, there's the feeling that there has to be a sort of reckoning with these questions. So what happens is, and again this is to Nehru's credit, is that Nehru initially aims to hold elections in the summer of 1951. He's kind of stopped because of obstructionism by the states. Many of the states, mainly for these reasons, are kind of not quite ready to test their popularity. And you can kind of see why, because, for example, in Madras, the Congress fails to win a majority in the first election. So there's a kind of obstructionism that happens in the states. Nehru presses his chief ministers quite hard without success. And so elections are eventually delayed. And of course, that kind of gives them enough time to basically address these issues before going in for election. So basically, if I quote, on the morning of 25th January 1951, the Congress Working Committee meets at Congress headquarters. And again, the question, as reported by the press, is they discuss the question of how to galvanize the Indian National Congress so as to maintain its moral and political hold over the people. Over the final quarter of, over the sort of tail end of 1950, Sardar Patel had died. There had been the formation of a kind of dissident unit within the Congress called the Democratic Front, led by Kriplani and Rafi Ahmed Kidwai. There was kind of speculation that several senior figures could quit. The Nehru government itself had three major ministerial resignations over 1950: Mathai, Mukherjee, Niyogi. And it's sort of surreal to look back now and read the kind of press reports, because there are several editorials which keep questioning, being like, will the Congress survive in its present form? What will be the future? And so I think even if it seems surreal to us now to look back and think, well, why would people doubt the ability of the Congress to survive in 1951? There were several who did. And so I think this kind of backdrop is important to remember. And I think that kind of gives impetus to this kind of feeling that all these questions now have to be tackled head on before they go back to the people. And of course, the Allahabad High Court then stops the UP, it grants injunctions against the UP Zamindari Abolition Act, which it takes up for examination. And that kind of builds this idea that there's almost the government is sort of under a form of judicial siege, because these are quite big sort of cornerstones of government policy. So as things build up over the first few months of 1951, you have in January you have the Allahabad High Court judgment, which effectively stays the operation of the UP Act. You then have in March the judgment of the Patna High Court, which declares the Bihar Act to be unconstitutional. And then you also have in between, you have all of these things kind of brewing in the background. You have, once Master Tara Singh has been released, as I pointed out in a previous part of the conversation, he kind of declares his intention to bring on board, invites the communists and the Hindu Mahasabha to join him on a kind of common platform. There is this sort of democratic front which is bubbling within the Congress. So there are all of these. I wouldn't really class it as political turmoil, but there's all this. There's a lot of politics going on in the background, and I think it kind of leads to a situation where progressively the government, there have been adverse judgments on huge matters of policy, on reservations, on Zamindari abolition, and progressively the impression that one gets from reading Nehru's correspondence is a kind of feeling of siege almost. And there is within the Congress broad backing for a kind of collision with the Constitution and the judiciary. And when matters finally reach a head, there is, and you notice that there is more or less almost, I wouldn't say universal consensus, but there's more or less like enough support within the Congress party for the amendment to be contemplated. And it's done, they start drafting it as early as March, even though Nehru publicly keeps denying that an amendment is coming, or assures, for example, he attends a meeting of the All India Newspaper Editors Conference, where he assures them that the freedom of the press is something that is very dear to him, and they take it to mean that he has dropped the idea of a constitutional amendment, and they thank him voluminously for his generosity. So there's a lot that's going on, and politically, the kind of sense that I get is of a government consistently being forced onto the back foot, and on matters that it considered very close to. If there was anything that was a kind of matter of faith within the Congress, those two things definitely were it.
Yeah, in fact, you were speaking of the press and the newspaper editors, and it kind of made me smile, because I'll read out a quote first by the Times of India and then Nehru's response, where he sounds less like Nehru and more like Donald Trump, actually. But the Times of India quote is, and this is after they come to know of the First Amendment, obviously, quote, "It is a tragic irony that our popular government should at every stage feel the need of repressive laws against which leaders of our struggle for freedom cried themselves hoarse for generations. The whirling of times brings some strange revenges. The decriers of a government once termed satanic flatter our previous rulers by imitation. They resort to preventive detention even without declaring a state of emergency. Stop quote. And this is written in 1951, friends, not 2020. And Nehru's response to this is, so he speaks to the parliament about the press, and then, as you quote him, he's writing to his chief ministers about what he told parliament. So he says about that, quote, while appreciating the role of newspapers generally, I pointed out that some weekly periodicals specially had passed all limits of decency and were carrying on persistently a propaganda full of falsehood and malice. To remain silent may also have consequences. I have appealed to the newspaper editors to take it in hand. But if they fail, then something else will have to be thought of. Stop quote. Which is quite a threat at the end of it, that something else will have to be thought of. And otherwise, his fulmination against sort of fake news, to use modern terminology, is reminiscent of leaders one won't often associate with him.
No, he does it quite often. I mean, it's something that is really sort of eating into him, because he says it several times in Parliament. He says it to when he addresses the All India Newspapers Editors Conference. And most interestingly, he says it to at the end, when he, after the amendment has been passed on 11th June, Nehru is questioned on how the amendment was going to affect the press. And he says, I do not think that in spite of the heat raised in the recent debates, it affects the press much. You will forgive me if I say we talk so much of the freedom of the press, but the more and more I see that freedom might as well be exercised by anyone who has money enough to buy up a paper. Recently, it is rather an odd experience for me to see a newspaper within a week or 10 days completely change its policy, tone, and everything except in regard to one matter, and that was its rather extreme dislike of the government and me. That is the freedom of the press. So, I mean, it's quite easy to see that this was something that he took very, very seriously, and that he was very averse to any form of criticism.
No, and it also seems to me that, he would be someone who would have felt entitled to the adulation and adoration of his fellow Indians after all these years in the freedom struggle. But suddenly he's actually replaced, he's in charge of the colonial apparatus, which was otherwise oppressing them. And I can imagine the sense of entitlement he feels, and indeed that his descendants still feel that they're not in a similar position of power. Another strand that I found interesting in your book was about how, Rajendra Prasad, the president at the time, spoke out against him and, repeatedly asked him not to go ahead with the First Amendment. At one point, Rajendra Prasad says, quote, Part 3 of the Constitution, which lays down the fundamental rights, has a special importance and significance of its own. And it's an irony of late that this part, which stands above every other part of the Constitution, is the first to be assailed. Stop quote. And you also point out, and this seemed very strange and petty to me, that when, he wrote this letter to the cabinet, and Nehru said he'll read it out to the cabinet, but then he writes to him, quote, it would be exceedingly unfortunate if the public became aware that the president had a contrary position to that of the cabinet in such a matter and was pressing for its adoption by the cabinet, stop quote. In effect, telling, Prasad to shut up. So, how was this sort of dynamic playing out? I mean, today, of course, the president is a figurehead, but Rajendra Prasad was a heavyweight leader in the Congress party. And, and how was all of this playing out?
It's very interesting because Prasad and Nehru dynamic went through its ups and downs. Prasad, for starters, considered himself Nehru's equal. Secondly, his own conception of the president's role was not simply, he took the idea that he was to advise and guide quite seriously. So he wasn't a rubber stamp sort of president. And equally, Prasad was very willing to intervene in government and let his views be known. But crucially, he was well aware of the sort of need to maintain constitutional rectitude or, set good precedents. And so, for example, when Nehru writes to him and tells him it would be exceedingly unfortunate if your views were to become publicly known, Prasad actually doesn't let his views be publicly known. He's willing to write to the prime minister, but he's not willing to kind of jeopardize the whole setup by, stepping outside constitutional bounds, which, to be honest, he could have done if he really wanted to, but he doesn't. And the same thing kind of happens when the Zamindari Abolition Act is passed. The president has to certify the Zamindari Abolition Act, because it obviously contravenes a part of the Constitution, and it can be saved, or at least it's assumed to be saved, by a presidential notification or presidential approval. And when he gets the Bihar Law, Rajendra Prasad obviously recognizes the flaws in it, and he kind of tarries by asking for legal opinion, and he sits on it. And Nehru writes to him, again, when I quote, and he says, and effectively tells him that the cabinet have agreed to it, and threatens to resign if the president doesn't certify the act. And of course, Prasad then promptly does certify it, even though he doesn't really quite agree with Nehru or recognize what the need for this sort of tearing hurry is. So it's interesting to note that Prasad takes his role seriously, but is also effectively very committed to the constitutional order. At no point does he seek to kind of overturn it or to even intervene in a way that could be seen to be deliberately intervening in areas of government that he really should not be intervening in. So that is a very interesting dynamic. Equally, when Nehru often thinks that Rajendra Prasad has a propensity to exceed his brief, because his reading of the situation is that the president is duty-bound to follow the advice of his Council of Ministers, and things kind of come to a head when the amendment reaches Rajendra Prasad, because he obviously doesn't sign it immediately. He seeks legal opinion because he thinks the amendment itself might well be unconstitutional, because the method used to pass it, coincidentally, eerily similar to what was used recently in the case of Article 370. So Prasad suspects that the amendment itself may be unconstitutional, and he asks for advice from Alladi Krishnaswamy Iyer, whose advice we don't have on record, but obviously Prasad signs it in the end, so I think the legal advice he received probably indicated that that's what he should do. So it's a very interesting dynamic, but Prasad doesn't shy away from letting his views be known, and in most cases those views are quite the opposite of what the government have.
Yeah, and it's quite remarkable, because if in the current day, a president receives a letter like that, it's like leaked in 30 seconds and on Times Now and all of that. So, and your book also has this unlikely sort of liberal hero. Now you'd expect, for many people seem to think of Nehru as a liberal hero for some reason, but Nehru is a person who says, oh, these fundamental rights are a 19th century artifact. We are not in the French Revolution and, blah, blah, blah. But the person who is really defending them with great eloquence and passion is Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, where he talks about how the First Amendment cuts, quote, at the very root of the fundamental principles of the Constitution. He calls it, quote, the beginning of the encroachment of the liberty of the people of free India, stop quote. And then addressing Nehru during the heated debates, he says, quote, by this amendment, you are saying that whatever legislation is passed, it is deemed to be law. Then why have your constitution? Why have your fundamental rights? Who asked you to have fundamental rights at all? You are treating the constitution as a scrap of paper. Stop quote. And at one point, Nehru got irritated and apparently wanted to charge him with sedition, and only Patel stopped him from doing that. But, what is our sense of Mukherjee? Because there isn't much written about him. To my knowledge, there isn't a great biography. He didn't really leave much writing behind. But, you read him in the constitutional debates with Nehru and so on. And this seems like, one of the tallest, most principled leaders. So what's your sense of all of that?
He was actually a remarkably principled man, and that's borne out by, for example, his resignation from the Nehru cabinet. It's also borne out, quite importantly, by his resignation from the Hindu Mahasabha, because what people don't realize is that he quit the Hindu Mahasabha because he felt that once we have a secular state, there was no need or no space for a quote-unquote Hindu party anymore. So he's a very, very interesting and complex figure to look at. And one of the things that comes across in his debates with Nehru is that, unlike Nehru, whose debates are very impassioned, but also often short on facts and logic, Mukherjee is a very incisive speaker. And this is borne out when they speak, because most of the time when the debate happens, obviously Nehru presents his case and then Mukherjee replies as the leader of the opposition. So the first time the bill is kind of debated in Parliament, Mukherjee replies, and immediately after Mukherjee replies, the person to speak is N.G. Ranga, Congress stalwart and later one of the founders of the Swatantra Party, and he compares Mukherjee to Edmund Burke, and calls it one of the greatest speeches that he's ever heard in Indian Parliament. So it's interesting to note the kind of impression that you get of Mukherjee is very unlike what is often believed, because you hear of him in the context of Kashmir, in the context of 370, but you often don't hear of him in the context of freedom of speech, for example. And Mukherjee is one of the most dogged defenders of that freedom, and in many ways very, very prescient, because he keeps, one of the reasons that he criticizes Nehru again is because he's well aware that what Nehru is doing is laying a precedent for something far worse in the future, or in some ways providing legal and constitutional tools that are prone to misuse by anyone who, is willing to kind of transcend his scruples or like his sort of commitment to constitutionalism. And Mukherjee almost leads the kind of charge against the bill. And it's, I think he makes a very, very, very successful case for himself and for the opposition. It's reported widely in the press. It's, again, commentators often note that, I think the line that I remember offhand is the Times of India describing the debate between Nehru and Mukherjee and noting that the Prime Minister's passion was more than outmatched by the incisive logic of Mukherjee's arguments. And I think that that's quite apparent that he sort of read between the lines of what was happening far more clearly than many of the others did. And he was willing to stake out a principled position despite the fact that it had, caused him to leave the Nehru cabinet, almost kind of enter the political wilderness, and in many ways stake out a position that many of his own ideological fellow travelers are perhaps not the most comfortable with.
Yeah, and it would seem that, Mukherjee was, of course, borne out by history, not the history of the last few decades, but just the history of the next few years, in the sense that it wasn't just about those specific amendments or those specific policies which Nehru wanted to get through, but about the desecration of the Constitution and of constitutionalism itself, which had led Chief Justice Hidayatullah to once quip that ours was the only constitution which needed protection against itself. And the father of our constitution, B.R. Ambedkar, in fact, in 1954, I think after the Fourth Amendment, when he was no longer in government, said, quote, "We built a temple for a god to come in and reside, but before the god could be installed, if the devil has taken possession of it, what else could we do except destroy the temple? We did not intend that it should be occupied by the Asuras. We intended it to be occupied by the Devas. That is the reason I said I would rather like to burn it." Stop quote, which are strong words from someone who actually, was the driving force behind our constitution. Eventually it gets passed and it's a done deal. And you've, I want to ask you about the aftermath. But before that, I'll quickly quote you from your book where you've written this very eloquent passage. Quote, "The relationship between the state and the citizen was altered for all time. A precedent was set for easy, almost casual amending of the Constitution and the passing of retrospective legislation. A mechanism for bypassing judicial review was created. Sedition had been retrospectively validated. A host of public safety and press control laws had been made operational again. Free speech was curtailed. No longer would it be necessary for the security of the state to be seriously undermined for it to proscribe free expression. It merely had to be in its interest to do so. The subservience of the Constitution to government policy was demonstrated. The constitutional groundwork was laid for a host of repressive legislation to follow. A vital cardinal change had occurred, which would have immense long-term consequences for India, its people, and its politics." Stop quote. And the thing is, despite people paying so much lip service. I mean, people pay so much lip service to the Constitution. Even, Prime Minister Modi once said that it's his holy book. And for all practical purposes, Constitution is like what Mukherjee said. Nehru was turning it into a scrap of paper where any government, if it has the numbers, can just change it. And it's nowhere near as liberal as many people seem to think it is. And this is becoming, more and more explicit by the day, if it wasn't already before. What do you think are sort of the consequences for this? Does the Constitution no longer matter? Or, different question entirely perhaps, do those principles no longer matter? Was the experiment doomed to failure from the start?
I'm not sure whether I would say the experiment was doomed to failure from the start. I think it was quite a brave leap of faith, and everyone involved acknowledged it as a leap of faith. But I think, again, I'll quote you. It's a quote that I took from Sunil Khilani again, where he says, basically, in a setting such as India, individuality as a way of social being was a precarious undertaking. And then he describes Indian liberalism to be crippled from its origins, stamped by utilitarianism and squeezed into a culture that had little room for the individual. So everyone knew that it was a kind of challenging project to begin with. It was never going to be easy. It was never going to be, how should I put it, clean in a way. It was always going to be a messy process. But I wouldn't say it was kind of doomed to failure. If anything, the kind of the story of the First Amendment proves that actually there were many who were willing to, take it at face value. The judiciary certainly was. They were willing to, uphold constitutional freedoms and kind of read them quite expansively. There was certainly quite important figures within the political setup who seemed to be at least to be votaries of constitutional freedoms. There was a press that was quite vigorous in its sort of position and defense of the right to free speech. Organizations such as the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, who, today we would term as probably completely obsequious, was, for example, willing to stand up and, and be counted in a matter of, such political importance. So I don't think I would say it was doomed to failure. If anything, that kind of year proved that there was that it could actually have been quite a successful experiment if it hadn't really been betrayed in its sort of essentials by the people who kind of midwifed the experiment to begin with. We can't deny that these were the people who also wrote up the Constitution. So it was their experiment, and they failed it more than anything else.
And do you think sort of institutions also shape society in a deeper way? For example, there's this common lament that, oh, look, at the time of our independence, at the time of our freedom struggle, we had such tall leaders, and we have such not tall leaders now, so to say. And I've written a column again using incentives to sort of talk about this while pointing out that all the freedom fighters who came to the fore and who were tall leaders at the time of our independence had entered the freedom struggle and become leaders, not because they had power at the end of it or money at the end of it. They did it just to stand up for principles. There was no reward. So politics attracted that kind of a person. But when you have later on, when you have a sort of a structure where the state is an overarching Maibab and has so much power and essentially the similar oppressive role to what the colonial state had, then it will draw the kind of leaders who are attracted to power for power's sake and power to whatever. And therefore, those tall principal leaders will no longer emerge. And it would seem to me that the degrading of the Constitution, in a sense, would also have been a further disincentive for people of principle to actually enter the fray. Mm-hmm. Do you think there's something to that?
I think it's yes and no. So yes, sort of institutions and, precedents and the law itself and the Constitution itself do shape society in certain ways. It's hard to deny or even overstate the kind of normative power that they wield. Even today, for example, protesters who hold copies of the Constitution aloft, kind of what they try to do is they're trying to channel the normative power of the Constitution rather than, actually looking at the nitty-gritties of what the Constitution says. I'm quite shocked if they were to actually see what the Constitution says. But it's one of the reasons that the Constitution was written in the way that it was that a lot of figures, Ambedkar especially, had little faith in the ability of Indian society to reform itself, or for there to be a sense of corrective impulse originating from within society. And because they didn't have that faith in the self-correcting ability of society almost, or the possibility of any idea of social reform really originating from within society or taking hold organically within society, they almost had an overdependence on using legal forms to drive what they saw as social or political change. And ultimately, I mean, recently Pratap Bhanu Mehta, for example, wrote a column where he very generously quoted from my book. But again, the sort of crux of the column was that there's only so much that can be accomplished by the use of legal and constitutional tools. I mean, if fundamentally social questions can only partially be addressed in terms of legality. And I think that's one point where figures like Nehru and Ambedkar were perhaps over-enthusiastic about how much the law could achieve. And secondly, I think they were perhaps quite cavalier in thinking about the effects that would be generated by these sort of institutional mechanisms, because Nehru, for example, seemed almost unaware. I mean, it's hard to judge whether he was deliberately ignorant or genuinely unaware of the kind of incentives that would be generated or the kind of consequences that would be generated through the First Amendment. It's hard to tell. At best he was naive, at worst he was, malevolent. And so I think both these strands kind of intersected at this point.
So, sort of leaving history aside now and leaving your book aside and coming to the present moment and coming to the personal, I'm curious about how your book has been received because, as we discussed at the start of the show, we are in times where history has been weaponized, where Nehru is looked upon as on one side as exclusively the ideal liberal who could do no wrong, and on the other side as this demon who is responsible for everything that has gone wrong with India. And obviously, like any person, and as your book acknowledges, all figures in history contain multitudes, so all of it is true and all of it is false and all of that. But I would imagine that nevertheless, in your book, it would seem as if it's ideal fodder for those who want to blame Nehru for where India is today. So is that something you were wary of, and has that impacted the way your book has been read, where people are not actually reading the book for the nuance and the history, but they are just sort of weaponizing it? Has that happened?
I don't think so. I mean, I think history is always complex, and it's always. I don't think the job of a historian is to be kind, really, to anyone. It's to be as incisive as possible and shine the spotlight as bright as you can, and that's something that I've tried to do. I think I'm sure there are people who've read it because it can provide sort of intellectual fodder for an attack on Nehru and Nehruvianism. And I'm sure there are some people who've read it or have perhaps used it like that. But most reviews have generally been quite complimentary. The book doesn't set out to target Nehru. It's just that the things unfold in the way they do, and the episode is not particularly complimentary to Nehru. But equally, I think it's very revealing in the way that it kind of looks at Nehru as well, because Nehru had many aspects to his personality, and the fact that he was impatient, kind of authoritarian, imperious in many ways. I mean, those aspects of his personality are as important as anything else, as his sort of commitment, often kind of pedantic and tendentious, as it were, his commitment to democracy, to the idea of collective decision-making, etc. And so to have a more complete or rounded picture, you need both sides. And I think in that way, this story is very, very revealing. But some perhaps might have used the book in that way, but I think most people have taken it in the right spirit. I haven't really seen, all of the reviews have been quite sort of complimentary and nobody has really kind of seen the book as a sort of weapon against Nehru. I mean, it is what it is. So just one more point, if I make it, is that I'm sure there are plenty of people who would have disliked it or not read it or not engaged with it equally because they see Nehru as this kind of, grand liberal figure who I've kind of set out to defame. And so neither of those things are true. I mean, history is neither kind nor generous. It just is.
It is what it is, and I found your book was, very fair to all the characters. And what I found especially revealing about your book is not so much necessarily the people and the events involved, but also how it shows through them that intersection of human nature and the structure of our politics, and how, people in positions of power are corrupted by that power and are, responding to incentives. I had a great time reading your book, and I recommend to all my listeners that they go out and buy it. Tripurdaman, I've taken a lot of your time today. Thank you so much for sharing your insights.
No, the pleasure was all mine. Thank you so much for inviting me. And it's been a great honor to be able to have this conversation with you.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, do hop on over to your nearest bookstore, online or offline, and buy Tripurdaman's excellent book, 16 Stormy Days. It's a must-read. You can also follow Tripurdaman on Twitter at Tripurdaman, Tripurdaman. You can follow me on Twitter at Amit Varma, AmitVarma. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in. Thank you for listening, and please behave in a constitutional way, whatever that means. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.